Brilliant. Okay, thank you, Diego. Hi, everyone. My name is John Narayan. I'm one of the co-conveners of this seminar in contemporary Marxism. We are very happy today to host a talk on Marx and AI, which we've got a wonderful collection of speakers, which we're going to kick off now. And I guess AI is on everyone's agenda, whether you've been tracking its impact in our daily lives or celebrating the decimation of bits of the US stock market a couple of months ago. Depends what your anti-imperialist politics are like. So what we're going to do is we're going to have a section of interventions and then a response, and I'll guide you through that. So let's just crack on. Just to give a heads up, as I said just before everyone milled into the room, we are recording this. So if you don't want to be seen on anything, please take your camera off and maybe even change your name if you want, if you're under surveillance. We will kick off our conversation with James Steinhoff, who is an assistant professor in the School of Information and Communication Studies at University College Dublin. He is the author of Automation and Autonomy, Labour, Capital and Machines in the AI Industry. And just to give you the background before we start of how we were thinking about this, essentially we brought the authors of Inhuman Power, Artificial Intelligence and the Future of Capitalism together to provide us with a kind of snapshot into Marxist theory and AI. And then we have a response by Tongyu Wu, who I'll introduce properly at the end, to kind of bring this conversation together. But we really then want to open it up to you guys as an audience. As you know, every time we do one of these things, there's always very robust discussion. So I'll hand over to James, and then we'll do the series of interventions around the book, and then we'll kick off with the response, and then we can bring everyone in. All right, over to you, James.
All right, thanks very much, John, and thank you to everyone involved with organizing this for having us. It's a pleasure for the three of us to get back together virtually, at least to think about this book we wrote now a couple years ago. Obviously, the book came out 2019, so the state of AI as a technology has changed considerably since then. Most notably, that the generative AI boom has happened since then. The one ChatGPT-2 or something was out around that time only, and it was not. It hadn't hit the sort of inflection point, the jump that happened with the next iteration. So, I'm going to begin first by discussing a couple goals that kind of framed our approach to writing the book in the first place. And then I will talk about the argument of the first full chapter, Means of Cognition. And then I will pass it off to Atle and Nick, who will each talk about the main thesis of two of the latter chapters. So, goals that should inform the writing of the book. So the first one really was to conduct a sort of imminent critique of Ray Kurzweil, right? The prophet of transhumanism, the guy who wrote The Singularity is Near, and The Singularity is Nearer, which came out just late last year. The singularity, for those who don't know, is, you know, this idea that this hypothetical moment in the future when machines hit human level capacity, and then because they can self-modify, exponentially exceed human capacities in all respects. Kurzweil famously maintains that the singularity will irreversibly transform every aspect of human life, including eliminating death, although he, right at the start of Singularity is Near, says there will continue to be a need for business models, right? So everything is going to change after the singularity, except capitalism, apparently. It's an interesting perspective. So that's one of the motivating factors, transhumanism, singularity, which has been ideologically right, predominantly, right? Whether of a libertarian variety or some less hard version of right wing, but transhumanism generally has been from that side of the political spectrum. But another one of our goals was also to speak to the left, and it was to speak to two positions we saw developing with regards to AI, which we've called in the book AI maximalists and AI minimalists. AI maximalists being people who mainly focus on AI's possible utility in a post-capitalism scenario. So you could think here of fully automated luxury communism theories, or whatever, post-capitalism theory. The minimalists are the people who generally dismiss AI as bullshit, hype, or sensationalism, or, ideology rather than a technology. And we think, that there's a kernel of, well, not maybe more than a kernel, but there's plenty that's correct about both those positions, but we think they are not the whole story. So we instead propose a third approach, and one way of thinking about what the book's trying to do is to elaborate what we have called somewhat dramatically an abyssal theory of AI. And what do we mean by abyssal? Well, we mean that while AI certainly is this object of vast unjustified hype, it serves to implement a fundamental dynamic of capital in a historically unprecedented way, even with its numerous limitations, and it has many, and we are not saying that it doesn't, but it does present the possibility of the elimination or replacement of living labor in a historically unprecedented way. And this remains far from fully realized. I like to emphasize that before someone tries to say that we're saying it's already here. We have not said that, and we do not say that. And it's also important to know that the current moment of AI machine learning is not the end of the technological trajectory. But we came to this perspective through another kind of immanent critique, which is of the neo-reactionary philosopher Nick Land, who is considered by some to be a leading intellectual figure of the alt-right. But back in the 1990s, he was a sort of weird Deleuzian philosopher who worked at Warwick, and he was centrally concerned with capitalism becoming increasingly cybernetic. And a thing that he said in a very short conference presentation once was that artificial intelligence and capital have a teleological identity. They converge ideally or materially at some point. And that is something we try to take seriously, but not from an anti-capitalist perspective. So let me then go on to talk about the means of cognition chapter, the first real chapter after the introduction chapter. And the main thesis there. This concerns the concept of general conditions of production. This is like actually a pretty fundamental concept in Capital and in Marx that doesn't get a lot of notice as far as I've seen, right? And these general conditions are all sorts of things, technologies, institutions, practices, which form the environment for capitalist production in a certain place or time. A simple heuristic way of thinking about it that's not completely accurate is infrastructure, right? So an aspect of the general conditions for production today would be the internet, obviously, more recently data centers. And what's interesting is that they're general insofar as they may be owned and operated privately, but they are generally available. So anyone can use Amazon Web Services today if they can afford it. Any capital can, right? In this category, we found interesting because it demonstrates a function of technology, an essential function of of technology under capital, beyond the direct production process, and the deployment of fixed capital to automate labor, control labor, so on and so forth. And the general conditions are also important to think about insofar as they develop in a sort of lockstep with mode of production. And they have to be developed sufficiently to keep pace with the mode of production. And we got a lot thinking about this from a discussion in Volume 1 where Marx talks about how the production of standardized machine parts by machines was a necessary condition for the emergence of large-scale industry before that new technological dynamic could stand on its own 2 feet, it needed machines to produce machines. And we suggested that, a way of thinking about AI, a possible future trajectory might be capital pushing it forward, not just as a technology for automation of labor in the direct production process, but as a component of the general conditions, right? As a kind of increasingly ubiquitous technology. And we continue to think that this is a useful way of thinking about AI. And some support for this thesis has been provided by some recent analyses. There's a paper I would point out called Big AI, Cloud Infrastructure Dependence and the Industrialization of Artificial Intelligence by van der Vlist, Helmond, and Ferrari from last year, 2024. And the others here have analyzed the cloud-based offerings of the big AI companies and found that across these different platforms, there's a more or less standardized array of functional AI commodities that are now available for purchase, right? You can go get computer vision functionality, drop it into your app, so on and so forth, right? So in some sense, this thesis about a generalized infrastructural kind of AI appears to be validated. But we can also say that there's also been a clear failure of this sort of dynamic. If we look at generative AI, particularly generative AI that works with language, large language models like the ChatGPT, all the professors here will be well aware of how these things work, I'm sure. We've all seen this like concerted push by the AI industry in the last couple of years to get LLMs accepted as a new platform, like a new layer of infrastructure on which different applications can be built. Now, this, of course, seems to not be working out for them very well because of the inherent, seemingly inherent tendency of these models to hallucinate, right? So this has undermined a sort of generalization of these and an industrialization of them. Beyond plagiarizing essays for students and generating like clickbait, for BuzzFeed articles or whatever, it remains unclear whether this LLMs will work as an infrastructure. Of course, capital has to keep trying. And the next thing, of course, coming up is called agentic AI. People may not have heard about this, but it's the new successor being pushed by the industry. So it's agents, systems that have some sort of logic or rule-based agentic system mixed with an LLM. I think Atle will come back maybe and talk about those a bit later on. So that's basically it. The one other thing I'll say about that first chapter is that we took another look at the concept of general intellect, made famous by the post-operaismo thinkers like Negri and Bertoloni. And they used it to think about new networked capacities of labor in the multitude, as they called it. But we've argued that flipping it around the other way is perhaps more useful, but there's not the time or space to go into it there. But we've argued general intellect we should think about it as capital's collection of skill and knowledge that it's accruing over time. But I think there I'm about just past 11 minutes, so I will pass it off.
Brilliant. Thank you, James. And next we have your co-author, Atle Mikkola Kjøsen, who's an assistant professor in the Faculty of Information and Media Studies at University of West Ontario, researching circulation process of capital, currently with a focus on metrology and economic agency of smart consumer appliances. Over to you, Atle.
Oh, again, thanks for the invitation. I'm very excited to be here with James and Nick and everyone who's joined to talk about Inhuman Power, because we haven't had a lot of opportunities for that since the book came out right before COVID. So it seems to be some missed opportunity. But now with generative AI being all the rage, it seems like the book has been taken up quite a lot again. So really thank you for putting this event together. So what I'm going to talk about now is the third chapter of Inhuman Power, Perfect Machines in Human Labor. And in that chapter, we make this heretical argument that artificial general intelligence, or AGI, that is, machines, could not only labor, but also under specific conditions create value. And we base this argument on how there is this striking similarity, or an isomorphism, if you will, between how Marx explains labor and labor power and how AGI is defined by AI capitals, engineers, philosophers, and computer scientists. So to explain, AGI refers to AI with capacities for reasoning with general knowledge, learning from limited data, and doing a variety of tasks in diverse and unfamiliar domains. In other words, as opposed to these narrow AI that are usually tied to one specific domain and perform a single or predetermined set of tasks, and they're explicitly trained for them. AGI, they're flexible, they're adaptable, they're creative, and can operate across many different domains, kind of similar to how humans. And this is why AGI has been likened to human intelligence. Although, as we stress in Inhuman Power, AGI need not mimic human cognition. And also drawing from Benjamin Bratton, that the range of possible forms of intelligence are likely a lot more diverse and alien than just our species alone. And we should also add that it is necessary to understand there is actually no philosophical or scientific consensus on what intelligence even is or means, although many definitions seem to stress a degree of generality and flexibility as the baseline. Now, one thing that when we wrote Inhuman Power, AGI was considered to be this crackpot science, only crackpots really working on it. And so there's an over-reliance on Ben Goertzel and Pei Wang, because there was one of the few ones who actually dealing with this in a serious way. It is still controversial in computer science, since there's doubt about its feasibility. And I just read a bit of a study just before this meeting, and it said that about 75% of computer scientists said that it's just very unlikely that it even will appear that. But the rise of generative AI may be seen as a step towards AGI, suggesting that this technology is actually less science fictional than previously thought. In Human Power, we proceed on the basis that this is pure science fiction, basically. So chapter 3 should really be read as Marxist sci-fi, to be honest. But then we have recently a team of Microsoft researchers published a paper in which they argue that GTP4, actually earlier versions of GTP4 before it was released, demonstrated sparks of AGI since, and here I quote, "It exhibits remarkable capabilities across a variety of domains and tasks, and that beyond its massive language, GTP4 can solve novel and difficult tasks that span mathematics, coding, vision, medicine, law, psychology, and more without needing any special prompting," end quote. And referring to such frontier models, a Google researcher and a computer scientist from the Stanford Institute for Human-Centered AI even argue that artificial general intelligence is already here. Now, another step towards AGI may be what James referred to as agentic AI. And these are just designed to autonomously make decisions and act based on goals without or with just limited human supervision or prompting. The difference from generative AI is therefore decision-making versus creating output like text, code, music, shady student papers, and so on, right? So whereas generative AI is reactive to user input, agentic AI is supposed to be proactive and adapt to different and changing situations. Its agency, or being agentic, coming from making decisions based on the context, hence, also without human prompting, right? Other features of agentic AI and why it may be a step towards AGI include problem solving, planning, and being able to interact with its environment. And this includes other chatbots, maybe even humans, and some type of tool use as well. Now, as James kind of mentioned, or perhaps they didn't go into it, but we talked about this earlier, agentic AI is based on the same foundation model architecture as large language models. And the reason why is because LLMs are quite flexible, so hence they're hoping that having the same architecture would give agentic AI flexibility, but they also understand that these hallucinate, or they have confabulations, as the term they prefer to use now. So they will combine them with traditional programming's explicit rules and predefined logic in order to make them less prone to making, in this case, the wrong decision. So in essence, agentic AI are positioned as true digital servants that are going to act on a user's behalf or in their stead. And this is in contrast to the kind of limited capabilities of our current digital voice assistants like Siri, Alexa, and Gemini. And these are more like co-pilots basically for us doing something. One other thing we have to say about AGI, and this kind of goes for all of AI, is that it should also be understood as a marketing ploy. And perhaps this is where it's at. It's pure marketing, in particular by companies that are trying to seek investments in order to prop up their stock market price. And here OpenAI is a case in point, since, as Brian Merchant has argued, they deploy the term most often at crucial junctures in the company's fundraising history. And as we know, like all AI, AGI can be wielded as an ideological weapon of class warfare to make workers accept existing or worsening labor conditions. But what is evidently clear by now is that AGI has been completely embraced by AI capital as a project that is not only feasible, but possible quite soon. So even computer scientists will say, like, this is very unlikely. The profits of AI capital keeps promising the singularity will come, you know, in 10, 15, 20, 40 years. So creating AGI is now an express goal by many AI companies, including OpenAI, Anthropic, Microsoft, Google, or DeepMind in particular, IBM, and Meta, and there are more. In addition, robotics companies like Sanctuary AI, Beyond Imagination, and 1X all seek to create embodied AGI, basically androids or robots. Some even are supposedly going to have a sense of self and goals. NVIDIA, Google, and Tesla are also in this space. But regardless of the feasibility of AGI, since AI capital is taking this technology seriously, Marxists should consider its potential implications. And by doing so, we are at the very least politicizing the future, and not necessarily then ceding it to the proponents of the singularity, the neo-reactionaries, or even Marxists who go along with the now orthodox interpretation of the fragment of machines that technology like AGI would lead to the automatic negation of capital. It's kind of back to our argument after this update, because chapter 3 is arguably the most dated of all of the chapters. So AGI then profoundly challenges Marx's axiom that labor is an exclusively human characteristic, and how labor power exists only in the physical form, the living personality of a human being, as Marx writes in Capital. His argument for why animals cannot labor are relevant to the argument we make because they can be applied to the behavior of AI too, whether narrow, general, or something in between. So as Marx argues, human beings have a conscious and willful purpose behind what they do, while the productive activity of animals is instinctual or biologically determined, so-called life activity. So in his ruminations on how animals produce from the 1844 manuscripts and the beast versus builders or beast versus architect passage, depending on the translation you are reading in Capital, Marx identifies several cognitive capacities that make humans unique: imagination, learning, flexibility, planning, and creativity. And all of these capacities makes human free in their activity. Obviously, there are also bodily capacities here by referring to the cognitive here, since we're talking about AI. So all these make humans free in their capacity, meaning that they're able to adapt to new situations, tasks, or environments. For that reason, Marx claims humans can produce universally, meaning across different domains, as opposed to the one-sided domain-specific production of animals, or for that matter, narrow or generative AI. Now, modern ethology has demonstrated that the sharp distinction Marx draws between humans and animals cannot be sustained. Animals with high encephalization levels, so mammals, birds, and cephalopods, are considered generalists, and their productive behavior is characterized by actually a pretty high degree of variability and adaptability, and even exhibiting creativity, imagination, and planning. And likewise, large language models like ChatGPT and DeepSeek, or vision language models, VLMs, like DALL-E 3 and Gemini 2.0, show emergent generalist capabilities in the digital domain. In other words, they are flexible. Based on their training, they have adapted to different domains, especially the multimodal ones that can transform input from one medium into another, like text into image or into video. Through such transformations, these models clearly demonstrate creativity and imagination. You know, what else can we kind of call their hallucinations, right? And if they're given chain of thought prompting, they also appear to reason and make plans. But that animals, narrow AIs, and generative AIs can do some of the same things as humans, does that mean that they can labor? Humans are just far more flexible and far more adaptable and have a range of possible behaviors as a consequence. But AGI still rears its theoretical head, since the very intent behind this technology is to rival human labor. Some definitions even tie AGI to labor, like Murray Shanahan, who says learning to perform as broad a range of human tasks as possible. Or OpenAI in their charter defines AGI as highly autonomous systems that outperform humans at most economically valuable work. Obviously, what economically valuable means here is up for discussion, and they haven't really explained. Yet another version, artificial capable intelligence, which is kind of like an in-between thing between AGI and kind of generative AI, ties basically that definition to being more or less a merchant capitalist. I'm not going to go into that, but if you're interested, I can explain that in the Q&A. Now, while still being a theoretical technology, as I explained, AGI's capacities and what they supposedly will be capable of doing is remarkably similar to Marx's concepts of labor, power, and labor. They are isomorphic. Therefore, we argue that labor, power should actually be grounded in general intelligence, not in the human, because by grounding it in general intelligence, it severs the connection to human and theoretically allows for other beings to labor. Now, as of today, 2025, in March, only human beings can labor. But if AGI were indeed realized in kind of the capital's most wet dream, we would have another being that also could labor. And in Grundrisse, Marx appears to suggest that machines could develop a generic capacity to labor in a kind of a very much of an aside in a longer kind of passage, referring to, quote, the invention of more perfect machines which would rob it of the character of being a machine, end quote. This is like some 60 pages after the fragment of machines. So contrary then to Marx's axiom that machines cannot create value, this argument suggests that the perfect machine is negating its own being as fixed capital and kind of becomes its opposite, variable capital. So as I've written in a different piece, and as we also quote in Inhuman Power, a perfect machine is therefore a machine that can create value, but therefore it is no longer a machine. Now, but just because AGIs could theoretically labor, it does not mean that actually they could create value. If it is merely deployed as an intelligent means of production, it would actually be a slave, a living labor machine, to use Marx's language from Grundrisse. As such, AGIs would still just be fixed capital and would technically not even perform labor. Therefore, to be perfect machines to both labor and create value, AGIs must become doubly free, legally free subjects, but deprived of means production to be forced into exchanges with capital. In other words, they must be proletarianized, turned into wage laborers. After all, surplus value can only arise from the fundamentally antagonistic relationship between workers and capitalists. So what would happen to humans in this situation? Not bound by the limitations of biology, AGI would be able to think faster, do things faster, and would not need to engage in superfluous activities like breathing and defecating. So humans will become an outdated hardware, rendered obsolete to the valorization of value, as we write. The status of humans in this situation would be reduced to wild animals, or as Nick has called it, the squirrel thesis. Some may choose to go through capitalist transhumanist transformation and become immortal wage laborers, but therefore more like AGI than human. In this scenario, the emergence of AGI would not lead to the collapse of capital as suggested in the fragment of machines, but to capitalism without human beings, an inhuman mode of production marked by superintelligent class struggle with AGIs personifying both capital and wage labor. Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Atle. Thank you so much. Next up, we have the final co-author, Nick Dyer-Witheford. He's a professor in the Faculty of Information and Media Studies at the University of Western Ontario. He's the co-author of Cybernetic Circulation Complex, Big Tech and Planetary Crisis, which is out this year with Verso. Over to you, Nick.
Thanks. First, I want to reiterate the thanks which James and Atle have already expressed towards the organizers and all of you participants in this event. I turn now to questions of AI, refusal and reappropriation, counterpower, and the possibilities of communist AI, issues which we raise in the final chapter of Inhuman Power. I will suggest that A, resistance to the capitalist deployment of AI is already apparent and likely to increase. B, that experiments in repurposing AI for a post-capitalist world are discernible, albeit only dimly. And C, that the ratio between AI abolition and AI appropriation in communist strategy has yet to be determined. Dan McQuillan has recently and compellingly analyzed what he terms fascist AI, an analysis we largely agree with. However, we would argue that fascistic AI is merely the sharpened point of an already weaponized capitalist AI, one that is now being unleashed in the Trumpian core of hyper-imperialism without even the pretense of regulation and with heightened hostility towards demonized groups blamed for capitalism's self-generated instabilities. AI as a specifically capitalist infrastructure will, we believe, be primarily used to intensify the extraction and realization of surplus value, as well as to enhance the defenses and aggressions of competitive capitalisms, both against their rivals and against their perennial collective enemy, the working class, which AI aims ultimately to destroy or, as Atle has just described, mechanically transfigure. Where we fully concur with McQuillan is in his observation, and here I quote, "If the whole of society becomes subsumed by algorithmically ordered relations and enrolled in machinic optimization, then society as a whole also becomes a site for contesting the imposition of those power relations. AI's generalizability and its intensification of social crises creates a position from which to question the totality of social relations." In Inhuman Power, we identified the potential for a multifaceted, polygonal social resistance to capitalist AI. And I think we can say that since the rise of generative AI, such resistance has indeed materialized in several forms. First, in strikes, such as those in 2023 by Hollywood writers and actors, and currently by video game voice and motion capture performers, strikes fought in part against AI replacing their creative labor with digital replicas. These strikes have also overlapped with those of port workers in the United States and Canada against other forms of distinct but still AI-related automation involving inventory management, robotic warehousing, and automated guided vehicles. A second related but distinct and geographically separated strand of worker action currently ongoing is that within the AI production process itself, particularly that conducted by workers in data labeling, content moderation, and various forms of ghost working involved in the creation of AI systems. Third, and this is something that you will know well about in the UK, there's been extensive litigation by authors, artists, and journalists opposing the unacknowledged and unrewarded scraping of their work for AI training. Fourth, we see protests by ecological and communal movements against the energy consumption and environmental impact, especially on water and electricity grids, of AI data centers, such as the supercomputing center of Musk is establishing in Memphis. Fifth, we witness activism against specific surveillance-related deployments of AI for purposes ranging from immigrant deportation to denial of social assistance and the creation of autonomous warfighting systems. Sixth, we see hacker attempts at data poisoning and AI model disruption, including adversarial prompts and the creation of digital honeypots and tar pits to snare scraping agents. Seventh, there's increasing whistleblowing on a variety of AI's scandals and misrepresentations by a growing mass of tech workers, many of whom have in fact defected from the major corporate owners and sponsors of AI development systems, such as Google, Microsoft, second. And eighth, we can now include in this list the public sector resistance being offered by US government workers opposing Elon Musk's Doge project, which seeks to fire and replace them with AI, sparking the broader anti-Musk Tesla teardown movement. Given the scope and diversity of these struggles, I think we can say that we may be witnessing the early stages of an AI-centered cycle of social resistance. Now, while Inhuman Power, in its preliminary and early survey of such struggles, emphasizes the component of refusal of capitalist AI, it also explores the potential for a communist reappropriation of AI. So the question that must be raised is, do current struggles suggest any pathways towards an AI, not of the abyss, but of the bridge across the abyss to a post-capitalist world? Now, such reappropriation obviously can operate at multiple levels. At a basic and perhaps trivial level, one can talk about the generative AI being repurposed for militant organizing, automating e-flyer production, or composing picket line oratory. But more substantially, we can raise the question of whether we may, in the near future, see AI being used, for example, to mark capital's dark money networks, or and expose tax haven fraud, or counter landlord collusion in rent rigging in a kind of reverse Doge strategy. Beyond these tactical applications, however, there are, of course, broader speculations on AI's role in a post-capitalist order. There is now a substantial literature on AI in socialist planning, often framed as a solution to the notorious calculation problem of planned resource allocation. Historically, much of this speculation about socialist artificial intelligence has taken a centralized and left accelerationist approach, an approach that has perhaps lost some of its attractiveness due precisely to accelerationism's fascist entanglements and to the growing awareness of the ecological destructiveness of unrestricted AI. However, newer iterations on this theme explore the possibilities of more decentralized and resource-efficient AI models suitable, possibly, for non-capitalist societies. However, we must also ask whether generative AI, trained as it is on surveillance capitalism data sets and apparently primarily optimized for advertising and sales automation, is a fundamentally capitalist form of AI. Could a communist AI depart from this logic? We think that it's important to take seriously Evgeny Morozov's recent exhortations for us to fight not merely for control over currently existing AI, but perhaps for the AI we deserve, rather than the AI that is being forced on us. An AI which he suggests might be one governed by what he calls ecological reason, rather than instrumental reason. Now, I think that this concept remains perhaps significantly underdeveloped, but in as much as Morozov is suggesting that ecological reason posits a view of intelligence that stresses both indeterminacy and the interactive relationship between ourselves and our environment, rather than being chained to the accumulative logic of capital. I would venture that we may find early expressions of such AI applications in the work of climate and environmental scientists projecting future scenarios, in programs for communal participatory training, for strands of the current open source AI movements, and even in some of the blockchain related decentralized autonomous organizations, DAOs. All of these, of course, are compromised by their capitalist conditions of existence, and yet they may still contain seeds of prefiguration. Moreover, despite our acute awareness of the contradictions of the Chinese Communist Party, the recent news about the DeepSeek project, and perhaps more significantly, its public reception in North America and Europe, reveals a profound interest in non-proprietary, open source, and energy-efficient AI models. A transformation of digital systems along these lines would necessarily be part of a broader upheaval, the kind of systemic rupture historically emerging from extreme social crises. Need I say it? Such upheavals no longer seem implausible. Inhuman Power concluded with a dialectical account of resistance to AI capitalism, oscillating between refusal and reappropriation. And I think it is fair to say that we believe this zigzagging will be a feature of struggles waged in and against capitalism's AI infrastructure. For the question, for the transfiguration debate, the question of which aspects of capitalist technology may or may not be integrated into communist society is not resolvable at the level of theory alone. It demands the test of revolutionary praxis. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. That was great. So we've had the authors of the book, and now we've got a lovely respondent, Tongyu Wu, who is an assistant professor at Zhejiang University. She's the author of Play to Submission, Gaming Capitalism in a Tech Firm, which is out with Temple University Press 2024. And currently she's investigating China's AI development, focusing on data annotation industry. So Tongyu, over to you.
Okay. Thank you so much for inviting me. And I've been like reading the book and listening to the lecture. It's very exciting to learn about how other people think about the AI. I think I will just respond by address each chapter individually. I will start by James' discussion about the introduction and the first chapter. And when I read the book, actually, even though James didn't mention that a lot, but I found the argument about the general condition of the production is very exciting. And basically, the author talking about how the AI right now can just become the general condition of production, just like electricity. And actually, the author in the book also talk about there are two very important preconditions that can make the things become possible, make AI become the general condition of production. One is the state, and another one is the open source environment. So I want to talk a little bit about my understanding about the state, since like I've been suggested by the organizer that I should talk more about the contact in China. And I feel like if we talk about China, like state is like one thing that we cannot escape from. So basically in the book, the authors talk about like how the state play a very important role in coordinating all the resources to develop the AI infrastructure and making the AI the general condition of production. And as we all know, like China's state has a very, I would say, very distinct function in terms of to develop the AI. I want to support, provide a little bit more details with my research. Actually, we have a research team together, me and Bingxing Xia, studying about AI, interview with like Alibaba, ByteDance for over 5 years. What we found, the most important thing, the first thing is that if you think state as a very important factor, you will see China as the central state actually adopt a very distinct, the whole nation approach to develop the AI, which is quite different from the US or the European countries. And the state play a very important role in coordinating all the resources to develop AI and to funding the AI lab and stimulating AI, funding the AI companies. And what is very interesting is that we find the state's role is very complicated and sometimes even more contradictory than what the book described. For example, the state is always balanced between stimulating the AI development and putting constraint and regulation over developing AI. Like the government always plays the oversight of the AI companies' development by putting the license system. Basically, they want to make sure only after company can follow every regulation, such as ensuring their training data is clean, ensuring the model can produce very depolitical sized data output. Can they being licensed to develop their own model? So basically, that's just one example to showing like how in China the state play a very different role. And in addition, I also think it's very important and somehow related to the book is that how China's position in the global AI chain is quite different from the US or the European country. For example, we found like although China government trying to also invest the core AI infrastructure, like what mentioned in the book, like the chips or like the cloud computing facilities, but the government also tried very hard to leverage the China's advantage of the data resources and to use that to enhance the China's competitive advantage. So because of that thought, we can see that although all the other Western countries trying to outsource what they call the dirty work, the data work to the global South, what China trying to do is really protect their data as the rare resource and play what we call the inland sourcing model to ensure all the data circulating or labeled within China. So that's another case, I think, an example to show like how China operate the AI game quite differently, especially the state operate the AI in a very different way. And I think if we add that layer to the whole thought, can we still to make that argument about the AI become the general condition of production and the state played the role in it? So I want to maybe talk a little bit more, or we can wait to see whether there's audience want to talk about that a little bit more. And regarding to the third chapter about the AGI, I found that really super exciting. To be honest, I've never thought about that way before, like how AGI could actually be employed just like independent, like a human labor, right? And how AGI can even potentially to become the artificial proletarians. And in order to, what I also found interesting is that in order to turning the AGI into the wage labor, as the author said in chapter 3, AGI would need to be endowed with the independent legal standing and also the dependent on the capital for its survival. That's really interesting. And also, but the only thing is that I also find myself a hard time to imagine what exactly are the forms of the labor the AGI can actually perform and how the AGI as a wage labor can be extracted the surplus value by the capitalist. So I would be really appreciate if the authors want to like contribute a little bit more about that part. And there is one thing, it's not really important, mentioned throughout the book, also mentioned by Nick by the end, is the issue about the open sourcing and the open sourcing environment, right? So what I read from the book, it sounds like even for the first chapter, like the open sourcing consists as another very important precondition to make the AI become the general condition of production. And also there are several places also Nick's mentioned about the open sourcing movement happening right now in the US or like all over the world. But the things like I want to share is that as far as we know, actually right now, especially right now, major AI companies become more and more activist building the moat, right? Meaning that they were charging fees or like charging fees for API or like to monopolize the cloud computing, just want to transfer the open source system to a closed system, right? For example, as the transformer right now become too big to be offline, they all need to be operated on the cloud. So major cloud company like Google Cloud or Azure from Microsoft, all charging, or AWS from Amazon, all charging very high fees for those companies who want to running their artificial intelligence. Also, like if we all know, after October 2020, OpenAI start actually taking a charge for the tokens, right? They are charging the token fees. Basically, after they are charging the token fees, what they are joking about from the engineering community, like they change the open source environment to a closed source environment. So I was really curious about like what the authors think about like the current environment that to me, it's becoming like a more and more closed instead of the open source environment. So that's basically some of my basic thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tongyu. So what we'll do, if we give James, Atle, and Nick a chance to respond, and then we've got, well, we had 150 people, we've only got 146 now in the room. We can take some questions from the room because we've got a sizable audience. So James, Atle, Nick, do you want to respond to some of the comments raised by Tongyu?
Yeah, sure.
Perhaps Nick should go first since he will be
since he's got to leave.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. But so thank you, Tongyu, for that very thoughtful commentary. Yeah, I'll just respond to your point about the open source AI movement. Yes, by and large, I completely agree with you. I mean, I think that there is even an argument that the basic move which initiated the open source AI development, which was Meta, Facebook's release, or be it intentional or not, of some of its large language model code, was a very calculated business move, actually intended to preempt the potential dominance of Google and Microsoft by way of OpenAI. It's a little like the way in which Google released Android as a sort of open source operating system to counter Apple. And we've seen how all branches of open source have in many ways been colonized and reappropriated by capital, from the days of Linux on. Nonetheless, and taking all the factors that you pointed into due account, I think simply the width of dissemination that becomes possible with the emergence of an open source movement, however much capital attempts to corral it, still introduces, let's say, a certain element of indeterminacy into the overall trajectory. I wouldn't claim more than that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Go for it, James.
Shall I? Yeah. Yeah, I mean, thanks, Tongyu, for this commentary, and thanks for bringing up the question of the state. I have looked at it a little bit elsewhere, but mainly just looking at the emergence of the sort of competitive dynamics back in the Cold War era. But yeah, I mean, it's really cool to hear about your project, and I would love to chat about that research project there, because I've also done research on data scientists and the labor of making AI. I really find that quite interesting. And I didn't know that about the insourcing as well. And I guess the big question I have in relation to that is, will we see the AI industry in China differentiate itself notably from the capitalist West AI industry, right? Will the technology develop in a different way towards different ends, or will some use for LLMs arise? I mean, as Nick said, I'm pretty skeptical that LLMs have any real function, useful function, I would say, from, social standpoint. I think it's early days. It's hard to say at this point. And yeah, as someone not living in China, I have to say we're waiting for someone to throw the switch and activate the AI model that implements the economic plan.
Okay, that's my turn now, I guess. So yeah, Tongyu, that was fascinating. I loved hearing your perspective on Inhuman Power, and also kind of the Chinese experience of it, just to kind of also go with the open sourcing and how it's being closed. I think it kind of makes sense from 2 points of view, because I have to remember that just because you're selling commodity doesn't mean that it precludes something from being the general conditions of production. The same as you can charge for a freight train or container transport and these kind of things. That kind of makes sense in relation to it. It might be actually a way to generalize the conditional production, beyond what we can see if it's just completely open source. So it could be quite smart. But I do also think that the reason why we're seeing perhaps a bit of this closing of selling APIs, as you mean, and also, for example, now OpenAI released this kind of PhD research assistant for certain scientists, is that this is tied to how generative AI is just, as James has mentioned, like it's not making any money. It's actually losing, a staggering amount of money. I can't remember if OpenAI spent something like $700,000 per day, I think, on just basically running ChatGPT, or maybe it's per month, but that seems very low too, if it's per month, right? So I think that kind of makes sense that we are seeing them charging for tokens and these kind of things, because they have to make money somehow. Others are losing ventures. And one thing that we can see out of this is it could lead to perhaps another AI winter, or at least like some companies going bust, like the Web 2.0 thing happened. And then we can kind of see who's actually managing to stay profitable and who will actually be the big players like Amazon and Facebook in these, as we can see from an early example. Now, when it comes to AGI and what other labor it can kind of perform, well, this is also, yes, it's really hard to imagine, right? This is where you kind of have to take from science fiction. You have to take a science fictional lens to it, right? Because if we have a situation where AGI are workers in both capitalists, obviously the needs that would be required by AGI would be quite different. Is it compute? Is it memory? Does it operate to their bodies? What are they going to subsist on? Because they have to be dependent on the capitalist system in one way, right? So obviously there would have to be a change in or rather movement away from human needs into something completely different here, right? But we can also think here that even though we kind of posit AGI more or less as discrete subjects, almost as if they're all androids. We can also think of AGIs as not just that, it could be an entire supply chain, so then, it can be contracted by others to, do work for it. I do still think that the way in which that surplus value can be extracted, and obviously this is the assumption that capitalism is going to continue, would be through the wage still, and also, having the AGI to, work for longer than it takes to reproduce their wage. And here I kind of just remembered that, I can't remember the exact language from Capital, but Marx referred to as moments are the elements of production. Whether that moment is half a day or if it's, a microsecond, doesn't really matter. You can still extract surplus value out of any moment of time. So that's kind of how I would take that. But again, this is where, we kind of have to be a lot more imaginative than Kurzweil is, and just thinking of business models.
Yeah, I think if I can just say one thing, I think the fun challenge of this thought experiment is imagining a computer that's responsible for its own reproduction. Right. This is the basic premise of the argument, right? Is that the computer has to buy its own electricity and upgrades, which would be presumably continual upgrades. But yeah, that's a reasonable thought hurdle to try to overcome.
Brilliant. Thank you all for that. What I want to do, and maybe Tongyu will get you to answer that question about whether the Chinese social relations lead to a different AI environment a bit later. I would like to hear what you say with that. When we do the questions, Tongyu, even though we technically had you as a discussant, we'd love to hear what you say, because sometimes the discussants just feel like they don't have to intervene, but please do. So I'm going to open the floor. So if people would like to either put their hands up or write in the chat, someone's already put a question in the chat. But yeah,
could I actually just say one thing real quickly, that there are jobs posted on LinkedIn right now for AIs only. And they're trying to get people to send their agentic AI software in, I guess, in a competitive way. But yeah, is it nonsense? Maybe, but they do exist.
Right. Yeah. Well, how would you describe that in a kind of fascistic slogan, like AA jobs for AI workers? That we have Yeah. All right. So we have 2 questions in the chat, but I would actually like someone to, considering this is about AI, would actually voice their human voice. I may call upon you to talk. So Vishal, do you want to ask your question?
Sure, yes. Hi, can you
Yeah,
hear me?
go for it. Yeah, go for it.
Great. Yeah, so my question, which I think James just kind of got at, is the question about the reproduction of the labor power of this potential AGI proletarian. Would it be a consumption of computing resources, electricity? I don't know much about computing, other things like that. But then the question is like, what other things would they purchase? What other things would they be able to consume in the global political economy? And is a potential route this sort of privatization, like an accumulation by dispossession of sorts, of already existing open source code and access to subscriptions? Thanks.
Thanks. Yeah, I think it's super interesting. I'll just ramble on a little bit more about it, but I mean, you need bandwidth, and presumably there would be competitive bandwidth amongst different geographical locations who would have access to different infrastructure. And if you talk to anyone who's like a competitive gaming person, they will tell you how much they have to upgrade their hardware to stay competitive. So we can imagine if you were selling your compute power as labor power, then you'd need to continually upgrade to be competing for the cutting edge jobs, I guess. What do you think, Atle?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that's a good way of looking at it, but also we can kind of posit this in a different way too. We can also ask like, what actually would be the general equivalent? What actually would appear in the form of money? And this could very likely be compute itself. Compute is the kind of the big thing that all AI companies relies on now. It could be computing power, it could be bandwidth, it could be anything, right? That actually could be one, with money too, right? And I think James has a good point, because there would have to be a system of competition between this kind of proletarian, or AGI workers too, right? Because the whole argument present kind of is just positing, let's just extrapolate the society we have now, but then we just have AGIs, or hyper intelligent machines, right? So this is why we kind of have to take really this kind of big flights of fancy to figure this out, And one thing, I guess, the question that was asked, because if AGIs are only supposed to kind of reproduce based on their consumption needs or their kind of means of subsistence, then that doesn't really give enough of a dynamism to the capitalist economy. That is continually have to be growth, because obviously what we know now with consumer societies, we are consuming beyond our pure needs, right? This is where I kind of think I can bring in like another project that I've been kind of working on, which is extrapolating something from Inhuman Power, and that's something I refer to automatic capital. And this is in relation to this kind of funny little story that happened, I think in 2015, 2016. This was in California. Little girl, she was talking to Alexa. It's like, hey, Alexa, can you play Dollhouse with me and get me a dollhouse? And then the Alexa ordered a dollhouse and 4 pounds of sugar cookies or something like that, right? This became like a funny human interest story on the local Fox News station. And then the talking head, one of them said, like, oh, I thought it was so cute and funny when the little girl said, hey, Alexa, can you order me a dollhouse? And apparently that kind of, triggered a bunch of other Alexas to order dollhouses too, right? Whether that's actually, they were all delivered, that's another case in point. But, so the kind of thought experience I'm thinking of here is that, and this is also something Nick writes about in his latest book, that we can kind of have all these consumer appliances, and this is what I mean with, they have an economic agency. This is where I also think agentic AI can come in, that all of a sudden we might just have agents, we might even have AGI. They're kind of just, the role is really to reproduce capital, not necessarily to reproduce AGIs, but making sure that all the things are produced are actually being bought. Obviously the question is, how would they actually get the money to do this? But you can kind of also think in this way. So there might be like this kind of separation between different beings for what they actually need and their purpose in the sense that we have now in North America. We are pure, more and more just kind of consumers, and perhaps there are certain appliances like our speakers, our fridges, our toasters, and these kind of things. There are legacy kind of hardware from a human economy who now, for some reason, because their humans have died, they still have access to their old bank accounts and just kind of keep on with the consumption.
Just as an addendum to James and Atle's observations. Yeah, I mean, in order to conceive of a proletarianized AI, we can look forward into science fiction, but it's also worth looking back historically into the very roots of modern computational thinking, and John von Neumann's famous model of an economy built around robots producing other robots. In a sense, that's a skeletal account of the situation that Atle and James are talking about. He doesn't stress or really introduce the commodifying dynamics that system would require. But in terms of the sort of successive iterations of autonomous technological reproduction, it's a model that's actually deeply ingrained in the whole computational tradition. So I have to go at this point. My apologies. It's been great so far. I look forward to watching the recording. Take care, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Bye, Nick.
For joining us. And actually, thank you everyone who's been on the call, who's talked, because time zone wise, this has been a bit of a juggle. So thank you for accommodating us. All right, so the ice has firmly been broken. So we have a lot of questions. I'll take one from the chat and then I'll take the three with the hands up. So in the chat, Zhuzhang says, thank you for your fascinating work. In fact, Zhuzhang Huang, if you want to say this, you can.
Oh, I just I'm interested in knowing what could you talk about if your vision about post-capitalist repurposing of AI and its connection with the notion of labor. I'm thinking, so one subtext would be Hannah Arendt. So her differentiation of labor, work, and action, and she is interested in sort of exploring how capitalism, the danger of capitalism is turning work into labor. And so I was just recently reading this article about memory and how, the danger of AI is sort of kind of, even stripping man of its temporality, of extreme functionality, and this illusion of complete mastery. So just whether, so what is your vision of this alternative way of looking at AI and repurposing AI in a post-capitalist world? Thank you.
Thank you. What I want to do now is just take two more. So if I take Jamie and then Elio. Go for it, Jamie.
Thanks so much. This has been awesome. I'm interested in questions about intermediate forms of labor before we get to artificial proletarians. So, the example that you gave of AI jobs on LinkedIn raises the possibility that you could have the kind of equivalent of slave labor, right? You have AIs that satisfy the basic requirements that Marx gives for what it's required to labor, but they are owned as property by AI firms. And so, like, the path to full proletarianized AI, I think, is really complicated and kind of science fictional. But don't we sort of see the potential already for, OpenAI giving a bunch of kind of licenses to go out and then have these AIs compete for jobs on LinkedIn, and the money kind of returns to OpenAI and so forth. So just if one of you wants to talk a little bit about how those intermediary forms of labor could work before we get all the way to the proletarian version.
Yeah, I can start here. I think that's a really excellent question, and also, thanks to James to kind of sharing that see jobs on LinkedIn. And I think we can tie this in with the agentic AI, what both James and I spoke about. How we have now AI that are supposed to act in your stead. So I think that kind of it would be your personal servant, and I think it's better to kind of look into these servant relationships. Perhaps even, you know, I think calling a slave makes sense, and that's something we do write about in Human Power, but I didn't speak about it much today, right? So what I presume in those LinkedIn jobs is like, yes, these will be agentic AI. In that sense, they will be tied to you, right? And then you will actually get the wage, you know, that you would normally receive, or that the AI would receive. And in that sense, you know, we can perhaps even think of this as just a really modern version of, say, the putting out system or something like that, right? That was there at a very early stage of capitalist development, perhaps even, you know, also where, you know, had the male figure of the household also renting out, you know, the wife and the children to go and work, and they would be paid. So there's also some kind of historical precedent here, right? So, you know, perhaps, and I also like this question because perhaps, yes, this might be actually a proper path towards proletarian androids or AGIs, because then why would you need the connection to the human being if the agentic AI is now starting to work, you know? So, you know, I think that's, you know, you actually give them a lot of food for thought in your question here, and kind of excited to think more about it, because we kind of just speculated in a kind of very legal and formal sense of how AGI could become workers, rather than necessarily thinking through the practicality, other than, you know, obviously they would have to become dependent on commodities somehow. But, you know, this shows a more kind of, for lack of a better word, even though we're talking science fiction, realistic path towards it. So yeah, that's a great question and comment, Jamie. Appreciate it.
Yeah, and like this is a really interesting comment too. And I've been fruitlessly hacking away at trying to write something about something like this question. And one way that I have tried to wrap my head around this problematic is what conditions would there have to be for capital to be incentivized to make machines responsible for their own reproduction, right? What situations could arise where that would be appealing from capital's point of view? Because then there would be a line there. But I mean, the whole like artificial servants discourse has been around since Aristotle, right? Aristotle talks about artificial servants doing slave labor, basically, and messing with the economy, actually. So yeah, I mean, the short answer is I have no idea what those intermediate jobs would look like. I mean, would they even actually be jobs from a formal standpoint, from the standpoint of value? It's just really, really complicated fixed capital usage, you know, being rented out, and not at all labor. I mean, that would also it's going to be an interesting sort of situation when you have something that looks very much like labor, but maybe isn't actually labor.
Could I just jump in real quick as a follow-up? I think one interesting thing to think about here is the section on primitive accumulation, right? From Marx, where he's talking about what happens with the emergence of the wage labor is the labor divorcing itself from the rest of the means of production. And I think that there's things to think about there in terms of what that meant for the kind of surge in productivity and capital production, but also this idea that what you would require is specifically the ability of artificial labor to divorce itself from the rest of the means of production.
Yeah, you also that makes me think of the idea that proletarianization is not always a negative. It's not just a negative process of deprivation, right? It's always a productive process, like thinking of Federici's sort of analysis, right? Proletarianization as this productive disciplinary process.
The double freedom.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
I
the double
could,
freedom we did comment on, and I think the divorcing from the means production is a key thing in this. It's just like what would be kind of say the equivalent to land for an AGI, right? This is the sun, is it the energy requirement, perhaps something that they got for free before, like electricity and these kind of things that we now are just giving it away, right? But then that is something, you know, the threat of being, say, unhooked from basically the GCP, like the general infrastructure of being able to survive. But perhaps you also answer the first question.
Yeah.
I was asked like AI in post-capitalism, and this is also where it's kind of really hard to give a proper answer rather than giving speculative ones, right? But I think one of the first things that would happen, this is something that Nick referred to as the I think he used the transfiguration debate, but I think it's actually really called the reconfiguration debate. And
I like the religious version of it, though.
And I think one of the key things is that to what degree can we actually use current AI that's been trained on more or less capitalist, racist, sexist kind of data? Can we actually use this for anything good in a kind of post-capitalist society? And one of the lines we kind of argue for, I think, at least in the conclusion to Inhuman Power, perhaps also this might something we just talked in between ourselves, is that we would have to basically train AI on communist data. So we have to get data from a communist society to actually put it towards communist ends. And this is kind of where I think,
or a simulation,
as James is working on also how synthetic data could be an approach to this. And this is why I also think Tongyu's comment about like how kind of inlanding, your own data, in the sense that it's not like corrupted by, outside influences, in this case from old capitalists, could be a kind of interesting way of looking at it. But yeah, that's kind of what I have on that.
Yeah, I mean, I have a little bit to say on that too. I mean, I used to be more sympathetic to the left accelerationism and the like annihilation of work thesis, or that as a goal. I'm less inclined to do that because I think there wouldn't be anything left to do. And this idea comes from Jeff Noonan, former professor of mine, who I've been convinced by him that you wouldn't want to really automate everything out of existence because, I mean, then you would just be exposed to the sheer cosmic horror of existing, and probably wouldn't want to do that. Confront the void that directly. I don't think humans have the capacity for that.
I think here, if there's some good sci-fi that would explore this, I think Ian Banks, the late great sci-fi author, his culture novels, I think it really shows this. You have a bunch of intelligent beings basically running society on a civilization level, but also willing to work with humans who kind of need a purpose in life. And I think it's in the first book, Considered Phlebas. Usually this all these narratives concerns like something on the fringes. So this is where some guy who basically is an enemy of the culture. He's on one of these kind of big ships that are just called minds, basically AIs. And he goes to a cafe and, he asks this guy who's serving coffee. And he's like, why are you doing this? Like, so, and then he takes his cloth and he cleans the table. It's like, look, the table was dirty. Now it's clean, right? He's found purpose in that, something as simple as that, And then, so even though these mines, these big ships could be built by AI much more efficient, certain mines would be like, okay, hey guys, you humans, let's get together and we can build it. I'll help supervise my own basically production of my body. Right. This is where I just go to science fiction, and I think the culture in particular is a great example of that.
Yeah, and the other value of that series is that the culture is not like Luddite, which I think I support that element that to be skeptical of LLMs is not to be anti-AI in the future.
Yeah, so position I concur with, even though on transhumanism, James and I are vehemently opposed.
There you go.
Generative differences, as they say.
Yeah.
You still wrote a book together. It's okay. Right. So we have Elio, and then we have a number of things in the chat, and we have an applause. That's cool. Elio, do you want to go for it? And then I'll try and bring some people in from the chat.
Thank you so much. Some of my favorite authors today. So I've got two questions. The first one, staying on this topic of wages for the AI. Isn't the appeal of AI that it should be able to do a lot of work with the same dead labor being used over and over again, rather than mimicking living labor? And then in the schema that you presented at the start, I'll probably describe myself as a soft minimalist. So I recognize the importance of AI as a marketing ploy to repackage funding pitches for existing tech capitals. But I do see that it's more than ideology. I think the main reason why it's more than ideology is that the state is front and center in the development and rolling out of AI. So how would you explain the current policy convergence of Western states and the imposition of this policy also on the global south to industrialize AI worldwide?
Yeah, that's
Great
a-
questions.
Yeah, that's good.
Did you want to take more, John?
Yeah, I want it because we've got tons. There you go. Nick, do you want to come in and then I'll pick one up from the chat?
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Yeah. Thanks for the talk. I found them really interesting. First thing, I was really taken by the notion of AI being treated as a general condition of production. That struck me as something that there's something could really do with some time developing it. I have problems though with the idea of artificial proletarians, and I'll try to put what my problems are, because you see, when you talk about value, or when my understanding of value is socially necessary labor time, that's one aspect of value, but it's the aspect of value if you want to do some analysis of society and what's happening in production. And crucial in that is it's labor time that creates value. Now, Marx spent a lot of time arguing against mainstream economists who argued that machines produced value. There's a lot of this in Capital and his letters. And it seems to me that you're doing the same thing. You're doing what mainstream economists did when Marx was writing. You've just got another version of, it's not labor that produces value, it's that machines produce value. And actually, it's quite fashionable at the moment to disregard the labor theory of value. If you look at value form analysis and all the Marxists writing in that tradition, like Michael Heinrich and others, they have an analysis of value that disconnects it from labor time. And I think that robs the analysis of real power. Some of the most powerful sections in Marx's Capital is when he's talking about the working day, and he's the division of the working day between what's necessary and what's surplus. And you see that really sort of the question I wanted to ask was a little bit undermined by this whole discussion about artificial proletarians, because I wanted to ask about what's the effect of AI on the rate of exploitation? When people are working in AI, are they more exploited or are they less exploited than other people in different areas of production? That's an area that I'm interested in, but that only really makes sense if you're talking about labor time. If with the use of AI, is the necessary labor time so reduced that those workers are enormously exploited? That's an idea I'm interested in exploring. It's not a common sense point of view, but then Marx says, when we look at Capital, often what we find on the surface is in reality. So my question would be around, how does AI affect the rate of exploitation? And then I've got those other issues about artificial proletarians.
Brilliant. And then Les, who was
We had two questions already. It's really hard to remember what people are saying.
I'm a sociologist, right? So we did it freeze and everything.
So can we just answer this before we move on? Because otherwise I'm gonna kind of forget, especially the first one.
Why don't you do those two then? Cool.
Okay.
Go ahead.
So just go on the question that Nick asked here. It's like, no, of course we deal with labor time. Labor time is an important thing. So is socialist labor time, right? That's not the issue here. What we are, if you read the chapter 3 on Inhuman Power, we go into detail of how, basically we're just using, actually Marx's labor theory of value to theoretically explain how it's possible for another being to labor. None of these things happen. Labor time is still, or abstract labor time is still what's positive value, right? It has to take the value form first of commodities. It has to be transformed into money. Money measures the labor time that was spent in production into social necessary labor time, right?
And it's a thought experiment. We're not talking about anything that exists right now.
No. It's a thing. In that sense, like, this is why we go through, and as I said, even in the in what I presented just here, it's like, yes, Marx is an axiom that machines can't create value. It's an axiom that only human labor composite abstract labor time, you know, and that this is actually based on antagonistic relationship between capital and labor, you know, meaning that the worker has to sell the labor power for living, you know, they get a wage for it, then they're put to work for longer than they actually takes to reproduce the labor, which is necessary labor time, right? But then, you know, since we're then hitching the very notion of labor and labor power to general intelligence rather than to humans, that opens up the theoretical possibility that we completely recognize as of 2025, as of 2040, maybe as of, you know, 2500 might not even exist at all, right? But it's a thought experiment because we have to politicize the future, because this is actually what capital is trying to achieve now. It really is their wet dream, right?
Yeah,
And
like
then,
sorry,
yeah, James,
can I say something, Atle? Yeah, like, so, you know, one way of thinking through what we're trying to do here, maybe more concretely, is to imagine, you know, some science fiction AI in a robot body, like a Terminator, right? It looks like a human. It has all the capacities of a human, more or less. Theoretically, a Terminator, you know, Schwarzenegger could hold a job and could be paid a wage labor, but that's a machine. And according to labor theory of value, strictly interpreted as a machine, ontologically, it just shouldn't be able to generate value. But it's not about the ontology of the machine, is what we're saying. It is about, at a certain level, about the value of the formal relations and where the person exists in the movement of value in relation to things like socially necessary labor time, the network of all of that stuff, and yeah, and how the value moves through a circuit of valorization. So yeah, absolutely. We're not saying that that's real at the moment. And unfortunately, as to empirical data on the rate of exploitation of AI being used in work, there's very little of that right now
it's
because
not being used.
so few people are actually it's so rarely being productively used in so many places. And even the places where it is being used, like journalism, there's still not very much data that we have found, especially not anything quantitative on the rate of exploitation.
Can I interject here now? Because this is where I think Aaron Bananov and Jason Smith, their kind of work on productivity in relation to AI and computers, they kind of showed that, you know, there's really not really growth in relation to that, right? So we published a piece last summer, and there was an afterward to edit collection called De-Automating the Future. And there's something we didn't manage to say in either other of our talks here, but where we see AI actually being employed is in the sphere of circulation. You see a lot more there in warehouses and transportation, but also straight up to in advertising, how to match commodities with money. We also see AI being introduced more in the sphere of consumption too, and this is something that Leopoldina Fortunati has kind of argued quite strongly, is that if you actually want to see where AI capital is moving in this day and age, we kind of have to go into the domestic sphere, because like, what is it that AI has been used the most for? Well, they're consumer goods. You know, they're also going to be consumer appliances, right? So where we see the most effect, and this is obviously, if you can use AI to speed up the circulation process of capital, you know, as Marx argues, you know, if you can do that, well, then you can create a lot more surplus value in the same period than it could before with a lower circulation time of capital. So there are efficiencies. We're just not seeing it in the sphere of production. We're seeing it on the level of circulation.
The Amazon one-day delivery is one of the probably most tangible manifestations of this, right? This is based on predictive analytics on a large data set, right? And then with routing that's coordinated by something, you know, a sophisticated version of the Google Maps routing algorithm, right? But much more complex. So again, the circulation, right? It's minimizing circulation time, circulation costs, rather than actually increasing the exploitation of labor in a lot of, well, so far as we can see, right?
But theoretically, yes, we presume that, you know, the necessary part of labor would go down. But, you know, as you know, as Banana and these people have shown, you know, it just doesn't show up.
And as the mainstream economists still can't find this either, right? Brynjolfsson, the big AI hype economist, is still talking about the productivity paradox, right? And every national government, that's actually just a good segue perhaps into Elio's comment here. is that the interesting convergence of every government in the world on AI as a tool for growth when there's zero empirical data that AI has yet to produce any growth anywhere. Because all it does is lower circulation time and feed people shit to watch on Netflix, right? But yeah, I think Elio, again, if you think you pointed to that the junction that I kind of mentioned in the last question there, like, isn't the appeal of AI that you don't have to pay it a wage? And like, yes, yes, that is the appeal of machines generally, right? So, and I think that's one of that's a salient critique of the thought experiment there, is like what would have to happen for the proletarianization of machines to happen. And I think one of the major drivers would be that you don't have to pay for, you're not made responsible for production of proletarians as capital, right? So you jettison them from the need of paternalistic direct reproductive care, you know, like the feudal lord had some responsibilities.
Yeah, but I think to go on with what James said, if you don't have to pay AGIs a wage, then we'll see the prophecy fulfilled, as in the fragment of machine. It's the engagement of capital, right? In the end, because where would value being produced from? If you're just employing them as fixed capital, right? In the end, they can't actually posit any new value at all, so there would be no surplus value created, right? So it really depends there. In that sense, yes, capital would go on existing for a while, but it would be more or less just redistributing the value that's produced before, just between different sectors of capital, in particular those that have high organic composition of capital, which is getting more and more and more, right? And this is what we're seeing already with the big tech firms and these kind of things, right? But at one point, the system would kind of run out of steam, basically, right? I think.
George Kafensis theorized this like 30 years ago, really. The paper
on Africa and self-reproducing automata. Great piece, really great piece.
Essential piece to thinking about AI, I'd say, really.
Yeah. And also the kind of the connection between the global north and the global south, because he's really thinking about how value creation is happening in spheres of economic activity where the organic composition of capital is very low, right? And currently, that is Africa still today, right?
Yeah, and strangely that piece never gets cited in the current like global value chain literature about AI at all. Unfortunately.
Yep.
Oh, thank you guys. So, Bruce, do you want to go ahead?
Okay. When Inhuman Power came out, I reviewed it and I said that I thought it was a big step forward in Marxist analysis of AI, but there were a number of things that I disagreed with, and I just want to raise a couple of them. I mean, some have already been hinted at. I mean, I'm very skeptical that AGI will ever happen, and therefore I think its use as a thought experiment is limited. That's basically because I think that there are things that are distinct about humans that can't be reproduced by AI. And I mean, Marx talks about laboring capacity, and in that it has included subjectivity. So there are all kinds of subjective activities of humans, joy, humor. I know these may be able to be emulated by AI, but that's not really the same thing, and it wouldn't. I know there's talk about emotional AI at the moment, but I don't think that's going to go very far. And Marx also talks about in the 1844 manuscripts, he talks about will and consciousness, and it seems to me a lot of the sort of science fiction disaster movie type thing to talk about machines getting will, and I don't think that is ever going to happen. There are reasons I could go into more, but I also wanted to say something about the repurposing of AI. It seems to me that if we talk about the repurposing of AI, we have to talk about a number of things. Firstly, how it's repurposed has to be done democratically and by involving the people who themselves are involved by AI, particularly in their jobs. I think we have to try and make the bridge that Nick talked about between current resistance and a future version of AI by making that an issue that both academics, unions, and workers focus on now, which has perhaps gone a bit under the radar. How would we actually set out from where we are now to repurpose AI? And it seems to me that one thing that we have to think about, and this was thought about in the 80s when there was the original use of the term human-centered AI was, human-centered systems, was to make systems that actually help people in their work and are there as aids rather than replacements. And it seems to me we can start talking about repurposing AI by thinking about those sorts of issues straight away now.
Brilliant, Bruce. Thank you. I want to bring Vincent. Are you still here? Who was in the chat? Could you ask your question?
Sure. Hi,
Go for it.
guys. I need to scroll up back to where I. Yeah. My question is really about it's something I've been thinking a lot about in terms of I wanted you guys to comment on the role of scarcity, both real and artificial, in the kind of march towards AGI. Because I think we have this belief that, capital is going to kind of smoothly develop this technology, but I feel like there are some internal contradictions, both, again, the artificial scarcity of having to commodify these services, and the problems that raises, but also something I've been following really closely is the chip sector and these underlying kind of material elements that are required. And so to what extent do those kind of investments in fixed capital also present contradictions, tensions that might be, fatal in the long run, or certainly impede this, I think, narrative of a march towards AGI. So I just wanted to get your kind of maybe expanded thoughts on, I guess, the reality of trying to commodify AI as a almost like kind of hindrance towards the larger capitalist development of AI, but also the issues around fixed capital investment, which, the United States right now, Trump can't stop talking about the hundreds of billions of dollars that are going to be invested in data centers and chip production. And of course, those sunk costs are going to weigh down in a lot of ways the real kind of return on investment in the long run. And of course, you have the competition from China, and they're doing an end run, I think, around some of those issues. So I wanted to get your thoughts on those internal contradictions that are perhaps threatening the narrative of capitalist AI more generally.
Okay.
Nice.
Thanks both Bruce and Vince. It's nice to, Bruce, I don't think I haven't seen you since HM several years ago. So I'm glad that you came and posed that question. I was also hoping someone would ask the question because I think the critique you gave in your review, and there's like someone else who's posted a similar review, they are kind of taking us to task a bit about our use of intelligence here. And I agree, obviously, there's a lot more to the human than just labor and capacities. There's a lot more to human subjectivity, like appreciation of aesthetics and art and these kind of things and whatnot. you also refer to will and consciousness, right? But here, I'm actually going to refer to an argument by a brilliant paper by Alan Alva. I think actually I might be here, so maybe he could jump in and explain his argument in more full. And it's also kind of what Turing said. It's like, well, if we can simulate it, does it matter? Does it matter really to capital whether this is real or not, right? And so what Alan Alva is arguing, and it's in this paper called The Fetish of Intelligent Machines, is that, to what degree can we actually understand, first of all, the fetish as really just like a more general argument about Marxist social ontologies. In that sense, in the capitalist mode of production at this particular juncture, intelligence or machine intelligence is just a necessary form of appearance, right? And if you think about what the fetish is, in the way I see it, is basically about behavior. How do we behave towards certain objects in a way, right? So we treat or behave towards commodities as commodities, meaning respect them as a private property. We also go through this weird ritual of handing over money for them before you can use them, right? So there's nothing inherent about things being commodities. In the same way, we don't necessarily have to have consciousness or actual intelligence in the same of a human way, right? This is also why we like AGI, because that intelligence need not actually be human to begin with. But the way in which, for example, our students are treating ChatGPT, they're treating it as if it is intelligent. They're treating it as if it understands, right? So in that sense, for all intents and purposes, socially speaking, ChatGPT is intelligent. It does understand what it does. Otherwise, people wouldn't behave towards it in that way, right? So that's kind of where I would go. I know kind of sidestep the argument, but also, as I mentioned too, is that there is really no consensus on what intelligence is. We also can't necessarily explain properly what consciousness and these kind of things. Perhaps we could do this in the future, but as of now, it's kind of up in the air, right?
Yeah,
So,
and
we're kind of relying sometimes on just assumptions of what these things are, right? So and we to your argument, Bruce, and it kind of might sound a bit kind of dismissive in a sense, like understand wanting to have this humanist defense of the human, but capital just would not care one bit.
And a different line of response I would take, which is also just like being a vulgar materialist, is that humans are a material system which exhibits consciousness or thinks it does, and exhibits joy and whatever other things that humans do. And we're just made of matter. And so theoretically, we cannot bar the existence of other material systems that can do that, right? On a real ontological argument level. Why not? Sure. Can't imagine it, but also 5 years ago, nobody could imagine what LLMs can do. Like, it's scientifically shocking what LLMs can do.
It's shocking that they show sparks of AGI too. That
like
Microsoft paper freaks me out.
it's easy to be dismissive of it as plagiarizing essays, which it is, but it's pretty shocking that they're able to extract this functionality from just scanning the statistical distribution of letters, which is all that it comes from, right? That's probably not going to be the way to make a human level artificial intelligence. It's not the only thing, but it's a strange, shocking thing that is an element of subjectivity that has been extracted from the statistical distribution of letters. Like, it's very bizarre, right? And for a materialist, just like somewhat vindicating for someone who's always like, well, if you just look at the history of proclamations about what machines will never do, it seems very hard for me to make pronunciations about what machines inherently cannot do as a category, ontological category.
Yeah. This is the AI effect, right? As soon as AI can do something, then we shift the goalposts and say that
chess was insurmountable like a few decades ago, right? And now it's trivial. You can run it on like a watch, probably, or I don't even know. Easily, you can run it on a watch. You can play computer games on a old math calculator now. You can run Doom on one of those. Let me say something about Vince's question, though. Yeah, the scarcity, especially in terms of materials and chips. I just read this. There's a great. He's like a mainstream, I think, like working for some conservative think tank author who wrote a book called Chip War about the history of the semiconductor manufacturing industry. But it's really fair and really well done, and it's not hitting you over the head with any right-wing theory, really. It's just kind of a somewhat neutral, relatively neutral history of this industry, which is all based around scarcity, right? That extreme scarcity. And what I learned from that was particularly how absolutely intensive the fixed capital investment is to produce cutting-edge semiconductors. It is why there's two basically factories that can produce the cutting-edge ones, the one in Taiwan and I believe a smaller one in Netherlands, and the one in Taiwan being the absolute leader. So yeah, we're setting up for something over that between the US and China over the control of that particular factory. I believe the owners of that factory have recently said that they will blow the factory up if they get invaded. If they get invaded by China, I think they said specifically. But yeah, I think there's a lot of complex dynamics going on here. I think that's all I have to say about that, though.
And yeah, I can kind of go on with that too, because I think Vince, we kind of had a brief exchange over this in the last couple of days over email. So I kind of know where you're coming from here, right? And the issue obviously is with scaling. This is the kind of the Western approach to AI. Let's just throw a lot more money and compute on it. Let's build the fixed capital, more server space, more cloud, these kind of things. And then boom, we're going to figure out the AGI problem somehow. But then, enter China, enter DeepSeek, who showed that, it can be done for far less resources, far less money, and these kind of things. If you just take like an established LLM and that becomes a teacher of a smaller one, then you can kind of shortcut that, right? So I do think there's a big danger now that it's kind of this that it could blow up, I think, in the Western world, in particular in North America, because OpenAI, one of the biggest one, the max amount of revenue they had in a year last year, I think was still less than $4 billion, and they're just burning through cash, right? And they're just dependent on just more and more investments in fixed capital, obviously not necessarily for themselves, but like Azure, cloud computing, and these kind of things, right? And I think this kind of also can connect into Bruce's question about how you would repurpose AI and kind of how workers, say, could tinker or activists, whatever. And this is where I think like the DeepSeek example is good, because from what I understand, that you could actually just download that and run it on your computer. You don't necessarily have to be connected to anything big. Obviously, it's going to create a lot of resources, right? But that actually all of a sudden puts AI in the hands of really anyone, right? So I think what we might see here, there could be this collapse of the hyperscaling from the West. That leads to, at least like some kind of bust of AI capital. Maybe it leads into an AI winter, because Gen AI didn't really do much, unless agentic AI actually becomes a thing, right? And what we can see then, kind of perhaps a return to kind of the early days of like video game production or software development, right? That leads to like how all this kind of small tinkerers starting to do things, both capitalists and also people who want to use it for more socially, proper purposes, even communist, and perhaps that could be something. We can also kind of envision that, as Nick said, that AI can be used to trace the kind of the dark money flowing on the various networks and these kind of things. So I think like this is where like this is also the open sourcing of AI, and why it's a problem that it might be closed could be an issue, right? Because if all of a sudden AI is put in the hands of everyone, obviously we have no idea what people could do, and this is where I think some type of proper resistance or repurposing or reconfiguration of AI could come from. But I still think the data question is really kind of the big issue.
We've got time for one last couple of questions. Alex, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah. I don't know why I disappeared. Yes, I'd like to go back to Bruce's question and his skepticism about AGI. I think it's important I'm wary about simply falling back onto a kind of assertion of humanism and of the human distinctiveness. Nevertheless, I'm I prefer to approach it from the perspective of class struggle, which of course is what essentially Marxists are trying to make sense of. And class struggle is partly about different groups of agents making claims on the resources that they collectively create and control. So what drives this making of claims? It partly is to do with intelligence and our ability to reflect and analyze and calculate and all that. But it's also to do with needs that are partly biologically based, but are also socially constructed in all sorts of ways, familiar and unfamiliar. So I want to know if there are these machines that have achieved AGI and so at least as intelligent as us, if not more so, what are their needs? What claims are they going to make on the resources of society? Because I think that, I mean, that's critical to how this robotic society would evolve. Would it simply be, I mean, I think at a certain point it's just null to talk about value being redistributed. The capitalists are creating money in some way, and they're using the robots to appropriate as much of that money as possible. But how are the robot? What basis is there for the robots to assert themselves?
Well,
what needs do they have?
I have two answers to this, and one comes from Marx and one comes from the transhumanist community there, where there's we do rely on this one paper by a guy called Stephen Umuhundro, I believe, who argues that if you have an AI, a human level artificial intelligence, it's necessarily going to develop some sort of survival instinct. This is a theoretical you know, a hypothesis that's it's widely accepted in the AGI community, which don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that's a reason to agree with it. But we use that as a basis of the argument. But I think you could also derive a similar position from the 1844 version of Marx and his discussion of needs and the creation of needs that goes on there. Because, you know, he famously, Marx is this non-fixed essence of humanity in the 1844 manuscripts, right, where needs are created. And I think if these machines are existed and thrown into this economy, the need to compete amongst them would generate the need to have a drive, right? It could get created by the need to, you know, compete with the other laborers. This is all science fiction-y though, right? And it involves imagining a machine that has drives and self-preservation and imperatives.
Yeah, and I think to sorry, can I just continue there? And I kind of agree here with James. I think it seems like we kind of come full circle since the first question kind of started out, like what would these things actually consume, right? But I think, you know, so one thing is the survival instinct that we built in, but also in the kind of robotics research now, when you want to have like an embodied AGI, they're speaking about like it kind of needs to have a sense of self, because otherwise it wouldn't be able to kind of navigate a proper space, right? Also, it has to be understand self and others, because these are supposed to be employed in a productive environment where they have to, you know, figure out what's a human being, what's just an object I can grab, and these kind of things, right? And in that, they would also have to have goals, right? So some kind of directed behavior. And in relation to goals, you might actually see these kind of needs arising, right? So we can kind of take it back a step, right? You know, so if you are, you know, an android or a robot whose goal it is to, you know, I don't know, it's hard to kind of come up with something on the spot here to kind of explain what needs it might have, right? But if it's supposed to be this autonomous agent, it's a kind of a because like also robots is one implementation of agentic AI, right? You mean like, okay, you have to go out and get, you know, a person ready for their say trip to, you know, assign location because they want to be at the beach and these kind of things, right? So then you send your kind of robot avatar out to get you plane tickets, to buy you all kinds of stuff that you would need for your kind of beach holiday, right? This is kind of a simple example, right? But then what if then this AGI becomes completely independent, but its goal is still in relation to, say, basically being a personal shopper for someone else, right? So, again, as James says, we are dealing here with science fiction, and we don't claim to really have all the answers here, because this is a thought experiment. We want to politicize the future here, because really what capital is trying to do, they're trying to create replacement workers. I mean, that's what they really are trying to do. I don't think they're thinking that this is going to actually be workers that we have to pay them, because I think the the desire or the dream is basically to have this kind of completely obedient beings that will just produce, for capital, continually without really objecting and being, not engaging in class struggle or any of these things that human beings do, right? But, I think this also kind of is a bourgeois fantasy that thinks like everything is properly rule bound. As we know, computers are supposed to be logical, but they do behave in really, really strange ways and might have different breakdowns, even though they're the same hardware.
Sorry, if I could come in quickly. I mean, what's unsatisfactory about this is that, say, if we're talking about Marx in the manuscripts, there's a very strong emphasis on humans as natural beings, as part of nature, and their abilities and needs being at least partially determined by that. Another way of putting it is that they're organisms. Now, in some sense, the AIs you're talking about are self-regulating systems, but there's still the question, if you talk about drives, what determines the drives? If you talk about competition, what are they competing for? Are they each seeking to ensure that they have an adequate electricity supply? What are their needs? I mean, I think these are big questions which, I think put a big question mark after the thought experiment that you're formulating and defending.
But I
Absolutely.
mean, absolutely. But we have been talking about this, what the needs are. We have actually answered several questions.
Yeah, I mean, bandwidth, cloud compute,
bandwidth,
parts, gears, screws, whatever, Wi-Fi.
If they have a body, they might need to, replace their body because other beings have better bodies than them. And here's the thing: what does the supply chain need? What does an AI that runs a civilization need? So like if we are just reducing it to completely be anthropomorphic and kind of being facsimiles of human beings, I think we kind of we are trying to bring in the human a lot too much, But here we can think another way to actually get towards AGI rather than this being created out of neural networks and kind of hyperscaling and whatnot, is that if you want to take a transhumanist argument seriously, even though this is still science fiction, right? But you have something called whole brain emulation, meaning that you're copying someone's mind. If anyone's seen the latest Jung Bong-Hu movie, Mickey 17, I think that's happened. He's just reprinted out as a biological being every single time. But you can also put someone like that in a machinic body, right? By actually putting then a humanly kind of downloaded consciousness into your robotic body, they would still borrow, or still have traces of its, own old needs and desires, right? So in that sense, you will have, certain drives that might lead to, people buying something or consuming something that is still based on the human economy or some kind of human libidinal economy. Or you can think of also androids that are basically trained by human beings and how to behave, and in the sense that how we also now can spit out papers based on kind of the statistical a pattern of human language, be it English or Norwegian or whatever, in the sense that what if we train these kind of AGIs on human behavior out there, including, and what is one of the key behaviors we have in capitalist society? Well, it's shopping, right? So what if we train AGI on base of the fact that shopping is a key human behavior, because that is something that perhaps humans companion would want, right? So maybe they inherit human needs, but they'll also generate new needs, right? And whether there are humans as an organism or not, an AGI that requires something would still have this interchange and metabolic relationship to nature.
Tony Smith has this great quote somewhere about capital as this higher order alien power that selects for things that are compatible with it and discards things that are incompatible with it, right? And I just imagine that sort of mechanism working on AI over time, and surely it's already working, but it's just a fucking nascent technology right now, and smarter it gets, the more that drive will be able to select on the system. If you do have autonomous agents running around like the industry is pitching as the next big thing, which I think is BS personally, but if you do have autonomous agents running around in the next year or two on the internet, they will have some learning capacity, and they'll be picking up on some sort of statistical patterns somewhere.
And also to add to this, so one of the benchmarks for this agentic AI is actually retail. So the kind of the two examples is retail and airlines. And this because this is very simple things to actually create, because agentic AI is going to have an underlying architecture of large language models, but also it's kind of joined with the kind of predictability of traditional programming. And with traditional programming, you kind of need to have like a pretty well-defined, cases, so you can kind of explain it properly in programming language. And retail appears to be extremely simple, like buying and selling, so like ordering someone a coffee or ordering something on Amazon. It doesn't really actually take that much, right? And the other thing is like, okay, booking a plane ticket, making sure that, you've either checked your baggage or you don't have it, and, what meal you want, the seat you prefer, and these kind of things, right? So, where we actually seeing agentic AI, or also AI being employed, is in the sphere of circulation, it is in the sphere of consumption, which is directly related to needs. And then, just to kind of double down on James's argument here at the end, this type of data would be sent back to whoever is training them. Hence, they would be trained in what the very least human needs are, and how to basically conduct yourself in the marketplace, and also basically in the commodity fetish, since they still would be behaving according to that logic, under material shell, AIs under a material shell rather than human beings.
Brilliant. Okay, speaking of needs, we actually need to go because we're well over 2 hours. We're actually taking a bit longer than we should have done. So, Elio, I'm not going to allow you to ask a question because we need to go. Can I have a big thank you to James, to Atle, to Nick, and to Tongyu for coming and providing such stimulating talk and debate. I think we could go on for another hour or two, but we need to go. So big thank you to everyone who came out.
Thanks so much, everybody.
Yeah, thanks so much. Excellent questions. This was really productive.
Yeah, I really appreciate people actually giving us the gears on this, because
we've been disappointed so far.
That's what we came for. So
yeah, we wanted to be provocative, so we really enjoyed this.
Thank you for the challenge.
Yeah.